So I really want to thank everybody for coming today. I'm Sean Wilson. I'm the president of the Youth Cycling Association, along with a variety of other hats that I wear. And I want to welcome you to the American Cycling Development Workshop Series, which is something that we've been kicking around for a while now, and it just seemed like an appropriate time to have this move forward. So I'm really pleased today to bring on Kristen Dieffenbach, who's going to talk to us about coaching and athlete development models. And she'll actually be moderated by Sam Callan, who I think some of you may know. I'm going to go through a couple of small items here before we start. So this is the first session of a number of these. And this is really a lead-in that's going to get us ready to do some discussion about athlete development within the sport of cycling in the United States, which looks different than a lot of other places in the world. At the end of this, there's actually going to be a survey sent out to see what day and time will work best for running these, but they'll be over the next 3 weeks. And the first one will be looking at youth engagement and enjoying the sport of cycling. And then the second one will be building for the future and looking at youth as they move forward in the sport and building competencies and capacities. And then we'll go into high performance athletics in the final discussion. And then what I'll do is I'll summarize everything, and we'll do another discussion of those findings and do any kind of tweaking that we want to do that. And this is going to be kind of a SWOT analysis of athlete development within the sport of cycling. And it'll hopefully lead to working groups that we'll be able to have in the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. In early February, I've set up to actually have Marco van Baan come on from basically from the Dutch Federation, who's going to talk to us about a program that he's put together for them, which they call Talent Vision 2030. And so he's excited to be able to work with us on this project. We actually do have a working group that's already getting set up. It's going to be on track development programs. We have a lot of interest in this area right now. And that'll actually be chaired by Pete Taylor and Bob Francis. We don't have a day and time yet for that, but it will start about the last week of January. So just a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this session and it will be available on the Junior Cycling Network channel. There are actually USA Cycling coaching CUs available through my business, through bikecoach.com. That'll be for all these different sessions. And then if you have questions, use the QA box on Zoom. We're not really going to be monitoring the chat box for the questions today. And then at the end, we're going to actually, like I said, we're going to have a survey to find the best day and times for those discussion sessions, because we want this to be an open framework for everybody to be able to comment and provide their input on these things and try to find new strategies for us moving forward. All right, so I want to hand it over to Sam and Kristen.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks everybody. Thanks, Sean, for inviting me to be a part of this and to connect with some folks from the cycling world. I was strolling through the participants list and saw quite a few names that I recognize, so it's good to at least see your name if I can't see you virtually here. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Kristen Dieffenbach. And Kristen and I go back a long, long way, and her involvement in cycling predates me knowing her. Kristen earned her PhD from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, in exercise science with an emphasis in sports psychology. She's currently an associate professor at West Virginia University. And as if she's not busy enough, she's also the president for the U.S. Center for Coaching Excellence. And in all the rest of her spare time, Kristen, selling your book here, she is one of the editors along with Melissa Thompson of Coaching Education Essentials, a must read. I'm on chapter 5 currently. And she's also a member of the American Association of Sports Psychologists. Kristen has consulted with many NGBs, USA Cycling, for years, since about 2000 or so, I think, ish. And also with USA Hockey, with the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, and also the USOPC. And she really brings together a focus of really wanting to have youth sports be a place where kids have great trained coaches, which is part of the U.S. Center for Coaching Excellence. And she has coached at various levels, all the way from coaching her son's ice hockey team, all the way up to an Olympic mountain biker and Sam Schultz at the 2012 games in London. But her really emphasis is really, and passion is on coaching and athlete development and looking at this as a big picture thing. And one last note, Sean, it did my heart good to see that there are still USA Cycling CEUs being offered and taking places. Thank you for that. And Kristen, we'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you. And thank you, Sean, for doing this. And thank you, Sam, for that really nice introduction. As Sam always likes to remind me that I go back a very, very long time in all of this, but really am very passionate. And to sort of add to what Sam said there, I got started in all of this with, particularly with the sports psychology side, because I had become aware as I transitioned out of being an elite distance runner at the college level to taking on cycling, the number of people that I knew that were cyclists, that had been junior cyclists, they were still doing it, but didn't really love it anymore, that were just really just fried on the whole thing and felt very downtrodden because they didn't feel like they'd achieved what they wanted to because they weren't on national teams and this and that. And that really is what started me on this whole path of really taking a look at how to help in the system and how to help grow sports so that everybody loves it and enjoys it. And I think it's probably about 15 years ago now that the long-term athletic development models started really popping up on the scene in a large way, starting up in Canada with some of the work that they've been doing, but as well as in other sectors of the field. And I'm really excited to start to bring this full circle with the idea of, as Sam said, a great passion for really looking at the athlete and how do we support their best personal performance growth, whether that be because they love it and they just want to play for fun, all the way up to elite performance. But the thing that really gets me excited and about talking to all of you about this today is the conversation we're now starting to have about the importance of the coach in the model. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about this idea of coaching and athlete development models, how to use that ADM, it's often abbreviated as ADM, and how to inform your professional development and your work as a coach when you start to think about what do these models mean and how do they apply to us. And as Sean said, we'll take some questions at the end. This is what we hope will be the beginning of a lot of conversation. And what I'm really particularly excited about is this from the beginning integration that USA Cycling is starting to move towards, but also the at-large community of cycling coaches to talk about what does a development model look like in cycling and how do we help make sure that the coaches are getting that training and are on board from the beginning, from the development of the model to the application of the model. So really, really excited about all this. And so what we're going to talk about a little bit as we go through here is this idea of holistic development through sport. If you were to go back 20 or 30 years, you would see absolutely development models for sport. Most of those models would apply very heavily to high performance. And how do you take somebody from good elite to elite elite? I was originally a track and field coach, and that's where I started out. And all of the models that we looked at when I first started getting my training in that area were, how do you take somebody who's already shown talent and hone them to the Olympic level or the national stage or the international stage? And so we really are talking here about this much larger picture. And just to give you a sort of a sampling of the background of this, there has been a good bit of research as well as a good bit of call for this conversation around holistic development of people with sport as a part of this. And some of those things that you might be familiar with include the Project Play has the Sport for All, which has a lot of conversation in there with their 8 plays, which apply to getting opportunities for everybody, inclusion, resources in communities so that there are places to play, not only fields and courts, but leagues and teams. Also looking at how do we help make sure that things are developmentally appropriate for kids? How do we make sure that coaches are trained to work with athletes at a developmentally appropriate level? If you haven't seen it before, the quality coaching framework down there in the middle is a document from the USOPC, which really starts to speak to some of these ideas and how to be quality coaches. Shape America has a national standards for sport coaches, which has been around for almost 15, 16 years now, a little bit longer, that really looks at what are some of those fundamental things that a youth sport coach should be doing, really drawing from what we know about the pedagogy of teaching kids and how do we best work with children. And then most recently, those sort of 3 documents kind of in the middle there, we have the Physical Activity Guidelines for America, for Americans, the National Youth Sports Strategy, which are both government documents that start to speak to the importance of, and this is important because it's not new information per se, but it's within this modern scope of where we are with sport, how important physical activity and sport is from a foundational level for all kids all the way up through lifetime engagement. And that leads us towards Healthy People 2030, which is also a government initiative with several hundred initiatives that start to really talk about how do we help become healthier. And part of that conversation is really within this broader scope of sport that we're going to be talking about. And often people like to separate out this idea of physical activity and sport. And I think more so than almost any other sport out there, cycling has got a beautiful continuum of engagement and involvement where we see people can get involved very, very young, as I'll be talking about, all the way through. I have an athlete who's currently in her mid-70s and all the way up through, right? So we've got all those levels in which people can participate and compete. And that becomes a really powerful piece to our sport and where this model really comes in strong with the work that we do. So hopefully by now you have seen some version of an LTAD, long-term athletic development, or ADM, American Development Model. This idea of an active start and fundamentals all the way up through being active for life. If you've not read Dieffenbach's book that he did with Richard Way, Colin Higgs, and on the work that a number of Canadians did, Long-Term Athlete Development, it's still probably the best foundational book out there. It's a textbook by Human Kinetics that really looks at all the phases and stages and all the application issues of LTAD models. And I want to note here before we start talking a little bit more specifically about cycling that LTAD models or ADM models themselves are universal. They are ubiquitous. They are really designed for this development of holistic well-being. And then within specific sports, they have been picked up and channeled so to start talking about how do you get best development within that sport setting. And again, I'll talk a little bit about how cycling is a really unique piece within that. In the middle of the document you see there is also worth a read. It's the third version actually of the Canadian Sport for Life document, where they have done some very nice updating to their long-term athlete development model and their approach from a very global perspective. And their website, you just Google Sport for Life. And there's a lot of really good information on their site. And then the other, if anybody's really interested, there was a paper done a couple of years ago by Bailey and colleagues that looks across all these different types of models, from Jean Côté's work to Pierre Trudel and a few others, and different types of models that looked at psychosocial, emotional, physical development, all these different things, which really start to feed into this comprehensive LTAD model, which, as I said, is holistic, looking at physical, psychological, social, emotional, all the different areas of what development that sport can influence positively. So this is the one that the USOPC, our United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, has put together with the 5 stages. And I'm very, very excited that USA Cycling is currently working on this idea of developing, and hopefully this will be this larger group project, of taking this very general model and fleshing it out for what it looks like in cycling, particularly because we have such a huge influence in that first stage, as we'll see here. So let's take a look at the model a little bit more in depth. So what I really, really like about the long-term athlete development models is the importance of the foundation. And in the traditional models, they often talk about active start, getting kids moving from the very youngest of ages, all kinds of settings so they get good basic movement habits, good walking skills, all those types of things, falling, getting back up, those types of activities. Then moving into good fundamentals, so becoming more physically active and starting to master those skills as they move through their toddler and early preschool ages, and then really moving on to figuring out what does it mean to start to train for something, which might be our youngest of kids. But what I think is most exciting about cycling, which is why I chose those pictures, is we have this really unique opportunity as one of the fundamental movers, pedaling, but even more important and before that is balance. And so getting kids involved early with two-wheeled vehicles and balance bikes is an amazing way to lay one of the most important foundational pieces of athletic competencies, the idea of balance and proprioception, on which we can build the skill of cycling, pedaling, getting into those sports, whether that stays a complementary activity to their other sports or becomes their primary, or does a little bit of both, because again, we see that cycling is such a great opportunity for people to be competitive at different parts of their lifespan in different ways, unlike many other sports. So this model then calls for, once we've got a good foundation, we really are starting to talk about this pathway. And hopefully, if you haven't been exposed to this model before, I do want to point out this idea that while it looks linear, that it's an age progression, and while ideally someone would get involved very, very young and move up through the stages, it's not dependent on that. So just because somebody didn't pick up cycling until later doesn't mean they can't pick it up. Just because they came to the sport later doesn't mean they can't pick it up. But this is sort of the acknowledged pathway that fits with the best motor development and motor learning information that we have about how kids learn and how they progress. I'm going to back up for just a second to just point out, this really cool idea around the balance bike to highlight this idea. We all know that kids go from crawling to walking, walking to running, and there's sort of that natural progression that happens. And if you've ever watched a little kid, it's often a very messy process. They pull up on things, they fall down, they toddle and fall as they get into that phase of being able to really run. And one of the unique things about a balance bike is as they are straddling that balance bike and just trying to navigate and figure out what to do with those little handlebars, they go from that tentative walking on the balance bike to moving a little bit faster and moving a little bit faster. And in doing so, they experience that natural phase of running where both feet are off the ground for just a moment. And in that moment, they balance. Excuse me. And in that moment, they start to understand and build that ability to balance and to expand that till we see that little daredevil in the third picture who is balancing and scaring someone to death as he rides down the driveway that way. And so we really are talking about this really unique opportunity. And for those of you who's ever tried to teach somebody to ride a bike after the age of 20, 25, it can be very challenging because they're coming to learning the skill later in life. It's possible, just more challenging. So we start taking a look at this middle phase of athletic development, this idea of moving towards this develop and challenge, learning how to really train for the sake of not just fun, giggle, haha fun, but fun for the satisfaction of accomplishment, and starting to drive towards, it still should be really fun, but it starts to move towards a little bit more work, a little bit more serious at practice time or at training time. Moving on then to stage 3, where we're really starting to compete a little bit more. Ideally, competition is still secondary to training because there is so much to learn, and competition is a vehicle for learning and growing our skills as competitors. And very, very few kids are ready to compete on a very elite level. That doesn't mean they aren't doing it. But for most, it's still very much a developmental time because they are physiologically and psychologically still developing so much. And cycling is a late specialization sport where people really don't become elite until they get there. And then, of course, as we progress on, depending on their abilities, we get into that elite stage of competition. But as you notice, you have 2 blocks together because there's also a pathway to participate and stay engaged, whether it's riding for fun, brevets, touring, all kinds of different opportunities and areas depending on what discipline of the sport you're talking about. And then, unlike most sports, as I noted, there is the ability to move back and forth between being highly competitive as an age grouper or in senior competition and doing it more from a recreational perspective. So we really are starting to talk about this idea of cycling for a lifetime. And as coaches, being in a really unique position to help influence and support that development of our athletes across this span. So let's take a little bit closer look at thinking a little bit about some of the things that influence this and some of the things that we want to think about when we start thinking about setting up long-term athlete development model or an ADM model. Sorry, I'll use those terms interchangeably because we use them that way when we're writing, depending on if we're talking to an international audience or an American audience. So I tend to go back and forth, and we're working on an international paper right now. So I've got LTAD on the brain. So some of the big underpinning ideas behind this that really help influence how we coach is this idea of self-determination theory. This idea that if we can help build a sense of competence, confidence, autonomy, all of those different things in an athlete's experience, we really help to foster how engaged they are, how motivated they are, how much they enjoy it. From that, we're going to get great performance, persistence, creativity, all those things that we want to see in athletes if they're going to be successful over time at whatever their capacity is and stay engaged over time. So self-determination theory is one of those big areas of scientific discussion we talk about quite a bit as we think about how important and how valuable the LTAD model is in this picture. The other one we talk about quite a bit, which is where we start to come in, is this model, this idea of this being the curriculum for how we best develop athletes with right age, right stage development. Where is the athlete now? How do we best develop them? How do we move them through the model? That's a very athlete-centered approach to coaching. That's a very, how do I help each individual push their way through the pathway and find their right path? It's driven by the needs of the athlete, but it's the coach that has to be skilled and aware enough to know what does the athlete need at this age, at this stage, based on what they came in with, based on what their current skills are, what their athletic background is, what their personal background is, where their motivation is, and are they ready to go up? And just as a bit of an example, working with some parents recently, and there was a question about whether or not they would put their child into competitive sport at the age of 7. This was in a hockey arena, just because that's where I'm doing some work this winter. And our advice to them was to keep the kid just in a local, because the kid still was sort of, he'd go out on the ice, sometimes he'd engage, sometimes he wouldn't, but he wasn't super competitive yet. And if they wanted to allow him an opportunity to really develop his skills, he wasn't ready for the high intensity of travel hockey yet. Now, we have seen a number of kids who are that way at 7, and by the time they hit 9, they're all into it and they're ready. We've also seen kids that just don't have it, it's not where they are. And that's where the coach comes in to really help see and drive that stuff and figure out where those things need to be. So let's start taking a little bit of a look there about where you need to be as a coach. So coaching, of course, is this process of guided improvement and development in a single sport at identifiable stages of development, right? So this becomes a really important piece of how we are engaging in this process of long-term athlete development. How are we bringing this about? So let's take a look about how a coach matters. Any of you have probably seen me speak before, have seen me talk about this, because I've been talking about this particular piece for quite a long time. Coaches matter. We matter. We are one of the most important pieces in the equation. We know from the literature that one of the biggest reasons kids drop out, not the only reason, but a big one, is when they aren't having fun anymore. And at the root of that can often be a coach who is screaming or yelling or putting an expectation or pressure on the athlete that they're not ready for, or that doesn't fit who they are. We also know that coaches have a unique opportunity, particularly through the adolescent and early adult phase, to have an outside influence beyond family that can be incredibly powerful. And so we are a pretty important part of the equation. We're also the front line as an organization or as a sport adopts an LTAD or ADM model of athlete development. We are the front line for making that happen, making parents understand the decisions that are being made in alignment with an ADM LTAD model, helping athletes navigate through it, helping make sure the programs that we structure are designed for that. And so let's talk a little bit about how we do that, being that's one of our main focuses today. So in talking about this idea of supporting athletic development through coaching, as I said, that's our prime responsibility. Our primary goal should be supporting their development, because that does lead to high athletic performance and the gains that they make. So my apologies here to Tank McNamara with this cartoon, but it's one of my favorites. So hopefully he doesn't mind that I'm using it this way. But if we're going to talk about LTAD, ADM being a curriculum for how best to develop athletes, we need to stop for a moment and we need to think about, how are we qualified? What are our personal qualifications? What are our qualifications as a field to ensure that we're able to deliver that curriculum, facilitate that development, identify where the holes are, the needs are of athletes in that equation of long-term athletic development? What content areas and what skills do we need to have? And so we're going to take just a short look to begin to think about this a little bit, not just about them as athletes, but us as a profession, and hopefully also get folks thinking a little bit about, as you think about your 2021 goals of professional development, where are the areas where you might focus your efforts to continue to grow and develop as a coach. So this is the International Sport Coaching Framework. It was heavily influenced by the work of Jean Cote and Wade Gilbert, Pierre Trudel, a few others, and it comes out of the International Sport Coaching Framework, which is a publication by the International Council of Coaching Excellence. And it starts to take a look at this idea of, regardless of the context in which you coach, participation sports or high performance, there are 6 primary duties of a coach. And you can read those there on the screen: setting a vision and strategy, shaping the environment, building relationships, conducting practices and preparing for competitions, being able to read and react to the field, both in the short term and the long term. You know, we're not preparing the athletes to compete today. Hopefully we're preparing them to compete down the road as the sport grows and evolves. And then our own ability to learn and reflect as coaches, not just what do we learn and reflect on what we did with the athletes, but how we are coaching, and all those being fundamental. Recognizing, of course, how much we do of those might change a little bit if I'm working with a recreational level athlete versus a high performance, if I'm a head coach versus an assistant coach, but those being the primary duties. What we want to focus on is that triangle at the bottom. This idea of this foundational knowledge, this professional knowledge, the knowledge of your sport. And many of you will have gotten to the place where you are now because you've been cyclists and you have a tremendous knowledge of the sport itself. But it's also that foundational knowledge of motor learning, motor development, sports psych, exercise science, all those things that go into it, as well as the knowledge of how to teach. And we're going to come back to that point. Then we have intrapersonal and interpersonal. And I always forget when you guys see it if it's reversed, but the bottom 2 corners as we're looking at it here. The ability to relate to others and build relationships and being responsible for that as a coach. And then also the ability to have introspection and to really reflect on not just what I did, but how I did it and how did that go and how did that interaction work and how can I improve that. And then at the very core of it, of course, having a good sense of your own personal values and philosophy. If you think to any of the USADA work about the values and the ideals that you have, your ethics, your beliefs, sort of your moral compass. Go to any of those conversations about, do you play an athlete who's injured? Do you make these choices? Do you make those choices? Can't make those. Who do you put on the team? Can't make those unless you have a really solid understanding of your personal values and philosophy. So let's take a look real quick at this idea of understanding ADM. And as we move into this, we want to take a couple of these really important foundational pieces to it. Across all ADM models, regardless of who's put it out there, the modern ADM models are all based on this idea that physical literacy is the foundation. If you don't have good foundation of physical literacy, you're going to be remediating skills. It's one of probably the most interesting thing of interfacing with the Division I coaches here at West Virginia University and other places, how often we're talking about high-level athletes who can't do basic movements because we don't always pay enough attention to those in the early phases of athletes' careers. We're working right now with the local hockey rink. The reason I'm so involved is we've got a big problem in foundational skills, so the kids get this far and then they can't go any further because they don't have those. We have the same problem in our area, baseball and a few other sports, but that's the one we're tackling right now. But even with my cyclists, so any of you who've been in road cycling for a long time know that we've always had a bit of a traditional problem of sending our kids over to Europe to race, and knowing that we've always had a problem with our kids maybe not having some of the foundation. They got great engines, but maybe they don't have some of those foundational. And that's not quite physical literacy, but it's still the upper level foundation handling skills that are so important that build off of our physical literacy. So somewhere in that continuum. Really based on this idea of building a quality, safe environment by design. And by safe, I want to make sure we're clear that it's both a physically safe space. So we're not asking kids to do that BMX drop straight out of the bat, right? They're going to work their way up to that Olympic level drop. but also making sure it's safe so that while they're being challenged, they're not being challenged to the extent at which they shut down and it's not a safe place to make mistakes, right? Because we know that if it's not a safe place to make mistakes, people will shut down and default to, let's skate in where I don't get into trouble. Let's skate in where and then they're not optimizing their performance. So we're trying to make it safe on multiple levels. We can throw safe sport in there as well because that's critical. Understanding individual age, knowing that it's not necessarily going to be tied to genetics. It might be related to how much training they had. Do they have a big brother, big sister, parent, favorite aunt or uncle who does these activities and got them involved earlier, or did they come to it later? Are they someone who is less mature or more mature? And so we've got to take all of those things into account as we coach. ADM requires playing the long game. This is a long game equation. This is a patience is a virtue. Bide your time. And I must say that probably 7 to 10 times a week at the rink, as I'm right now trying to help some of our local parents understand that it's okay that they can't do this yet. Just wait. It will happen. As I noticed before, cycling is a great early introduction sport, but it is absolutely a late specialization sport for 99% of what we do. Even our BMX riders are not really young. That doesn't mean they're not competing at a local level, but that, or at, the top level locally or nationally, but that's because we offer those things, right? And if we were truly looking at what's our best performance, we all know that that's getting into our national championships and other areas. Just because we offer a championship and somebody wins it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best in the country. And that's an argument that I've gotten into with lots of parents. But when you're the only girl racing in Nebraska and you win the Nebraska U14 national title, I am so excited that you're excited about the sport and passionate, but I have to temper her parents down because they can't understand why she's not on the national team. And that is a conversation I've had many, many times. Making sure that competition doesn't drive development, not taking upgrades just because you should. A long-term athlete development model really talks about mastery for growth, right? We don't, just because a kid just started to read, we don't throw them into the next reading group. Just because they've got multiplication, we don't automatically jump to algebra. Right? We make sure that they've mastered it to maximize development and to maximize their sense of competence and accomplishment. If we go back to the self-determination theory concepts that really drive staying engaged, staying motivated, staying resilient. And then training should be a collaborative process. This is something that's done with an athlete, not to an athlete. And the athlete needs to know that to help build their growth and understanding as an athlete so that they start to take that autonomy, that self. That doesn't mean that they won't need a coach, but that nature, that coach-athlete relationship may change a little. And then the importance, of course, of multidiscipline. And I think every single, actually go back up on that one, every single long-term athlete development model that's out there talks about the value and the importance of continued participation, particularly in the youth and adolescent years, but even into the later adolescence, of participating in multiple activities. It doesn't have to be that they are competing in multiple activities, but for full body growth, development, and balance, it's really important that they stay engaged. So go back, Sam probably helped me with this one with a timeline, but if we went back 20 years, we saw far more cross-sport participation, and you had speed skaters in the winter games and cyclists in the summer that were the same people, right? Because we did a lot more of that cross-pollination of sports. We've tended to specialize so much so early that we really have locked people in. And so thinking a little bit about how can we encourage in the off season, giving an off season, making sure that our developmental athletes aren't locked in to just the sport. And then as they get older and they choose to and they want to, still making sure they're doing some other things just to maintain physiological balance, to maintain proper health. So as we continue our journey of thinking about why do we as coaches need to know this and what matters, this is one of my favorites. It came out of the teaching literature, but this idea of Maslow before Bloom. So all of you who've had intro psych somewhere in your background, think back. This one should be something that you remember from way back in those classes. But basically all it's saying is that we need to always make sure that our athletes are safe and have both that physical and sort of psychological well-being, particularly looking at their physiological safety, food, sleep, often something I worry about with my college athletes. Making sure that they're in a safe environment, that they because they won't be able to focus or attend properly or grow properly. And then making sure that they have that sense of belonging, those being really crucial. We like to have that sense of esteem and self-actualization as well, but those really have to be there, particularly those first three, before we can even start to look at the talent development model. And Benjamin Bloom, he really is the gentleman that is sort of the father in some ways of the modern conversations around talent development and looking at how do we systematically and age appropriately do this to help somebody move through the stages of growth. And there's some great books. If you've never read Talented Teens by Csikszentmihalyi or Benjamin Bloom's book about developing talent in young people, those are some great foundational books in this area. So this is where, when we start to look at ADM as coaches, we really have to think about carefully, do what you can with what you have, where you are, and being really mindful in an LTAD or ADM model of thinking about where are my athletes now and how do I help take them from where they are to what the next stage is. You might be all prepared to coach the next U23 or national champion, but if they're not there, that won't be a successful endeavor. Now, that doesn't mean in 2 or 3 or 4 years, you can't set a path towards that, but where are they right now? And not just physically. I think you've all probably coached somebody who physiologically is incredibly gifted, but emotionally is still back in 8th grade, even if they're 25, right? And so how do we help them? Or they don't handle frustration well, or something didn't quite get taught or developed or a chance to blossom. So we've got to figure out where they are. So be the coach they need when they need it, being an incredibly crucial piece of the equation. And we can talk down the road and have other conversations around this in particular, but when we start to think about this as a coach, we've got to think about, how do you do this? So just a few parting thoughts on this as we start thinking about this. This is where we come back to us as a profession and you as an individual. Who are you coaching and what do they need, right? So if we blend together those two visuals we had earlier, the International Sport Coaching Framework with the USOPC's ADM, we start to think about, if we understand those things and we really have a good handle on that, it really starts to inform what you do, the training choices you make, what you have your athletes doing, and hopefully you've given some thought and some time to, we're doing X and this is why. It's informed by this science or this information or this experience I've had, which is informed by scientific models and stuff like that. And so we're really, our what's tend to be what we spend most of our time on. It tends to be what coaching conferences are often about and where we start. What we really want to emphasize here is also how you do it. How do you go about developing all of those different things for athletes and helping them develop those different things, their technical skills, their tactical skills, their psychological coping skills or management skills or strengths of focus, concentration, etc. How do you do it? And their physical training, I forgot that one. And their physical, how do you do that? How do you set that learning environment? How do you use current learning theories to develop a structure and an experience? How do you guide your interactions? How do you teach and progress? And, when you start, for those of you who teach skill development, what are your teaching progressions? Just like teaching somebody to read or teaching math, what's the progression? And then how do you physically as a teacher teach? You got 1 athlete, 20 athletes. How do you set up a classroom? How do you engage? How do you make it so it's an environment where they learn? So let's take a look at a couple of real basic principles to get you thinking. One is going back to the idea of athlete-centered coaching. Traditional model, sage on the stage, coach-centered. I'm in charge, listen to me. I'm going to tell you stuff. I'm going to tell you why you're going to do it and what you're going to do. I'm going to have a preconceived notion, and this is all about results, right? We're just going to come in, I'm going to dump it and go. And if you didn't get it, I don't know what the problem is. An athlete-centered approach really calls for coming in and facilitating learning, not just dumping content. So we're going to be asking questions to figure out what they know, figure out how they are best learning, looking for solutions with them or looking for goals with them, looking for opportunities to figure out what they know, and then helping them understand and think about the next piece. So it might be the difference of coming in if you're doing some sort of cornering drill and telling them how they should do it versus coming in and talking to them about how did that corner go? What do you think would have made it tighter? What do you think would have made it better? And giving them some opportunities to think about and engage in the process, right? So we're getting into some of the core fundamental motor learning, motor skill development, pedagogical techniques of teaching as just one area to start thinking about how do I do the what's of what I do. There's also this idea of emphasis on the athlete's well-being. So we're being constantly aware of what's the challenge level? Are we challenging too much, too little? Where are they sitting in terms of their sense of competence and accomplishment? And really trying to help make sure from an age-appropriate perspective that we're providing the right challenge for them. And then, of course, always coming back to that whole athlete. So a couple of the steps here of thinking about if you're going to deliver an ADM type content for athletes, if you're going to really be thinking about what LTAD or ADM looks like, what are the stages of really becoming an athlete-centered coach who is being driven by an athlete-centered curriculum of development? Well, the first and foremost important thing is to really think about your philosophy. And often when people think about their philosophy, they tend to focus on athletes in my program will do X, athletes in my program will get Y, athletes in my program will develop this. And what I would really encourage you to do is to back up and say, athletes can expect this from me. I will strive to be this kind of teacher. And really see if you can't bring that lens back on you, thinking about that red core triangle of values and beliefs and what you really think about long-term athlete development, and most importantly, your role in long-term athlete development. And how does that inform who you are as a teacher, how you teach? Then starting to think a little bit about how you develop your coach self-awareness. So how are you reflecting on and considering how you engage as a teacher? Probably haven't said that yet today because I say it so often I tend to forget that when I've said it and when I haven't, but coaching is teaching at the very, very, very core. You get into super elite athletes and you are a manager, but 99% of us are coaching. We are teaching. We are helping people learn skills, put stuff together, guide their learning, guide their growth, guide their development. So how do you develop the self-awareness to think about your own coaching behaviors? Not just the training plan you wrote, but also how you implemented, how you helped grow somebody. Thinking about your coaching style and really trying to give a hard look to how much are you sage on the stage and how much are you helping facilitate growth? How often do you tell and how often do you draw or give a platform for them to experience? Do you tell first what you saw, or do you ask them to tell you about what they saw and help shape or guide or get them thinking differently? Really understanding your athletes. As I said before, you can't do an athlete development approach if you don't understand them and where they are. And if you're dealing with the littlest kids, that starts getting into fundamental skills, and do you know what those should be? And if you get into older skill athletes, what should they have learned and what do they need after you? So what were the two pieces that bookend where you have them? So you know if there's something missing, you can check it and remediate it. And if you know what they need to have to go next, how do you prepare? And as an example, a lot of times when I used to run the up until this year, one of the national camps for the U23, or sorry, not the U23, for the junior development program. So you have the mountain bikers come in. And as we assess the kids, one of the things we were really aware of is they wanted to go and be college racers, or as they switched over from being juniors to seniors, race successfully. And so one of the things that we worked on very hard during the week was helping them gain an awareness and understanding of what's the difference between the levels and how might their training need to shift, and how might that inform the choices of whether they wanted to go super high performance, stay competing, but recognize that it was just something they liked to do for fun and that was okay, or if maybe they weren't ready for that level and they wanted to think about it a little bit. And so we really had to be thinking about what do they need and how do we make sure that they're at least on the trajectory to get those things. So understanding where they are. Of course, building your coach-athlete relationship. Many of you probably heard me speak about this before, but that's always, even with our adult athletes, from a position of power, that's us. We're the one who they are looking to for help and guidance. And so it becomes our responsibility to really drive and build that relationship and keep the communication open and work on our interpersonal skills. And then, of course, supporting the athlete's self-awareness, which starts to become a nice piece of helping understand them and developing some of that awareness and helping them learn. So hopefully I've hit on all the stuff that Sean and I talked about that we needed to start the discussion of thinking about the importance of a solid ADM LTAD, and hopefully the development of one that is cycling specific and not just the universal broad-based one. And then most importantly to me at least is, how do we as coaches start thinking about how can we best support and implement that? Because a curriculum without teachers won't do anything, and teachers without a curriculum won't do anything that is really getting us anywhere from a collective growth standpoint, and it really shortchanges the development of an athlete. You still may teach them things and they still may go somewhere, but will they go as far as they could if we had a real quality systematic pathway that ensured that they got the active start, the fundamentals, and all the pieces along the way that helped ensure that they were physically, psychologically, socially, emotionally, all those different things, getting the most they could out of themselves and out of their sport experience. So we'll leave it there. And I can see that there are questions popping up, and I do not know where we are with any of that. So I will let Sam and Sean step in and guide us through a little bit of a discussion.
Cool. Excellent, Kristen. Sorry, let me just get my screens reset here.
That's why you need many screens, Sam. It's awesome.
Yeah. Well, I'm doing this from my dining room table right now, not my office. So I'm a little limited technology wise.
And Sam, thank you. I saw you popped up all kinds of good stuff over here.
That's my job, right? You
did a good job of that.
Put them in. So you have trained me well over the years. Yes. There are a couple of questions, and I'll get those in a quick second here and give folks a chance to sort of reflect for a couple of minutes and maybe think up some questions. But one thing that always stuck with me on this is, and you could please elaborate on this idea of fun and how fun changes as an athlete matures and also gains an experience. Because I think a lot of times you think of fun, you're thinking of laughing, ha, water balloon fights, I don't know, whatever else Barney King does at his camps with the juniors, all that sort of stuff. But maybe we talk about fun expanded beyond that, because we know it's an important part of keeping people in the sport.
It's funny you bring up Barney's name. That's like the third time today it's popped up somewhere, and I'm not sure why it's Barney Day. For those of you who know Barney, I've worked many of his camps, and Barney's idea of fun is different. So we're not going to go by Barney's fun. No. Well, so yeah, and when you look at self-determination theory and the models of what keeps people engaged, it's this sense of competence. And I think that that's where we often get a little bit lost. Little kids giggle, ha ha, fun. They came, it was engaging, it was exciting, it was, but even in the underlying, they like to feel like they are good at something. They like to feel like they've accomplished something, they've done something. And so while giggle, ha ha is the littlest kids that come out and roll around, very quickly it also becomes about that sense of competence and that sense of enjoyment and self-satisfaction of, I accomplished something, I did something. Even if it's, we had practice this morning and the little girl who came off the ice at about 7, I scored 10 times on the goal. Keep in mind, she's 7, she's tiny. It's a big open net and there was no goalie. But she was thrilled that she scored. And I was like, yeah, rockstar, that's awesome. She felt it was fun for her. Whereas the older kids that were down on the other half of the ice playing half ice game, their sense of competence was, I got one in today, or the big guys didn't knock me over. And at some point that switches over to, and in sport, everybody knows it, right? You know if you're contributing or you're not. Sport has those, sort of that hard knocks feel of it. Do I feel like I've accomplished something? I've gone 5 miles, I've gone 10 miles. I cleared that rock garden. And so it's that shift there and helping people see that and helping them go from only the extrinsic shiny things to helping them really value the intrinsic, wow, that was fun to do. I accomplished that, I did it. And that competence is really the fun we're talking about, helping develop, helping foster, help grow. It's in intrinsic motivation is what we're really starting to get at.
Nothing to add to that. I think
ha is fun too.
I think asking your athletes what they found fun about sessions or what they enjoyed about it, no matter what the age, is a good input for you as a coach of, okay, wow, I'm dealing with a bunch of 9-year-olds. They didn't really seem to have fun in that session. There's some skills I want them to learn. How do I adjust it so that maybe it is a little more fun and engaging for them next time, so they'll create that nice learning environment for them as well.
Well, and this is where it also, though, as a coach, if you come back to this idea of thinking about long-term athlete development, sustainability in sport is going to come when somebody is able to weather the tough times as well as ride the highs, right? And so even if I pick up an athlete, whether they're 15 or 25 or 55, and the only thing they ever talk about is the extrinsic, the I want it, and that's it, I know they're not going to last in the sport very long, particularly if they're a junior and they're trying to go up the ranks of being a junior. Because at some point, you're going to get it handed to you. It's the nature of going into the bigger pond and being the smaller fish as they age up. And so as a coach, it becomes a really important piece for me from a long-term athlete development to ask those questions to get a sense of where they are and then start to try to help grow and build up that side with the understanding and the awareness. They don't believe me. So that, I don't tell them what I'm doing. So it's not like, oh, well, someday you're not going to win because they're not going to believe that. But can I build that wall up strong enough so that when the time comes that all of a sudden they become a senior racer and they're no longer the big dog in the middle of Iowa and they're racing on the West Coast and they're getting it handed to them, can they weather that? Can it still be satisfying, even if it's frustrating? So there's a little bit of that as a coach too. I need to know what motivates them right now, but from a developmental standpoint, how do I check in and make sure they've got all the skills they need to be sustainable long-term? Or when they choose to leave, they choose to leave just because something else has become shinier, not because they've become so discouraged or so dissatisfied or so beat up on themselves that they feel like they can't do it anymore. Because those don't come back. I'm always really, some of you guys may coach masters athletes who come back after leaving it from being juniors. And I get those a lot as often as consults or people who want to just talk about whether they want to get back into racing. And the reason they left is often very negative and very not a good experience. And it makes them, they want to race, but they're very anxious about it because it was such a bad leaving experience. And trying to help them figure out how to get back into it often means a big reset of what's the value, what's the purpose, is the win the icing on the cake, or is that really the only reason you do it? Because if it's the only reason you do it, it's not going to last. Usain Bolt's probably a bad example, Sam, but even he gets slow with age.
Yeah, but his slow is still so
I know. As a track and field geek reference for Sam.
Yeah, well, much as Meb Keflezighi does, who's one of my heroes. Even on his slowest day is still faster than I will ever have been. All right, so some questions here. We'll jump around a little bit. Addie asked about at what age do you suggest that junior female cyclists start working with a coach, and maybe just expand that to any cyclist?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And I think that when we start thinking about coaching, we've got to think about the purpose of the coaching. I think that there's nothing wrong with starting with a coach really early on, but why are they working with a coach, right? If it's somebody that's just helping them with some basic skills and some development, and it's, you getting together kind of like a little league baseball thing, right? That not probably the best example, but a couple times for a couple of weeks at the early part of the season, or maybe 2 or 3 times across a year, somebody that's not their own parent, because own parents are probably sometimes the worst teachers of their own children when it comes to these things, the expectations and the frustrations and just the dynamic. And so they could certainly work with somebody who's going to take them out on a ride and teach them a few things as a one-off. It really is more of an issue of where is the child in terms of needing to start to train and get ready for something at a higher level. I'm a real big fan of the youth mountain bike leagues that are out there, just because it's following a high school model, a little bit of coaching for a little window of time, and then back away and let the kids be kids for the rest of the year, right? So we're giving them a chance not to turn fun into work have to. It's here's the season. We're teaching them how to train. We're teaching them how to follow a structure, but then we back off and let them be kids. There will be some kids that will sort of gravitate towards, I really like that structure, I want to do more. And so they may be ready for a coach, 13, 14, 15 years old. But then the coach and the parents have to be really mindful of passions of teenagers run really, really hot. They will dive into anything headlong, whether it's the latest boy band or the latest crush or almost anything. They will go, right? And so we have to be the ones to sort of temper that just a little bit and help make sure that it's a healthy growth pattern and a healthy balance. And I use this often with parents. We don't get the preacher and marry them off to their first love, even though that is incredibly intense and they're often really into it to the point of grossing everybody out. But we know that that's not going to be the only thing and the only one most likely. So we sort of ride it out and let the flames go hot and try to watch it and make sure that they're not alone and all that good stuff, because we know that we got to temper it a little bit. The same goes with our junior passions. How do we help them push it, but not push it so hard that they don't have an opportunity to turn and move if they decide something else becomes more interesting? Because a lot of the kids will get really entrapped and then they blow up, as opposed to being allowed to sort of back up, go a little deeper, back up, go a little deeper. And so, I'm sorry, I'm an academic. Every answer is, it depends. It's a scientifically proven fact that we have to do that. It's in our contract. But it depends. So 13, 14, 15 can be a good age. Some kids aren't ready for that kind of structure, that kind of responsibility. And even at 13, 14, 15, I would be really mindful of making sure that it's not a year-round job, because we are a late specialization sport, and even our kids that are really good are still kids. And our development models sort of are showing us that that's really sort of the way to, that doesn't mean they can't ride year round, but how much are we trying to race them and train them year round starts to become a bit of a concern. So I'm saying coaching that age, but with the caveat that they are not yet professional athletes who need a year-round intense plan, if we're looking at LTAD models with any sort of seriousness. So I'm sorry, it depends.
So I'm trained as a physiologist. So ours is on the other hand.
On the other hand, yeah, I know. Our contract says it depends. I have to. It's in my PhD document on the wall.
Yeah, there's an old joke about the coach is looking for the one-handed exercise physiologist, because he keeps finding one that says, but on the other hand. So John, maybe you can appreciate that as well.
That was not good, Sam.
Yeah.
I very much appreciate it. But I want to keep both my hands.
Yes, I as well. So Kristen, a question about distance coaching here. When developing an athlete-centered process, can a coach be effective through computer coaching based on numbers with the prevalence of power meters? And then also as a stacking questions here, I apologize for that, but do skill development drills require an in-person, hands-on session or program?
Depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I had to say it. It depends. Let's go backwards. So if you're doing
Start drinking every time you do that, and we're not going to make it through the rest of this.
If you do skill sessions and you're doing them from a distance, you're making the assumption as a coach that your athlete has enough information and the right information and is doing it right. So are they doing those skills and repeating things that are good, or are they doing those skills and learning bad habits and repeating those bad habits? You don't know because you're not there to watch. Now, I distant coach as well, but there is that recognition of there's only so much I can do. And so I can tell somebody, go out and practice your corners, go out and practice that. Whether or not they're doing it well, I don't know, unless I'm asking them to video. And then we have the interesting challenge of, can I give real-time feedback, right? Because again, if I'm trying to help facilitate skill development and skill change, then I need to be able to see it and give real-time feedback. That's basic motor learning, motor development, skill development stuff. What was the first part of the question again?
No, that was about just the effectiveness of distance coaching.
Yeah. You can, you asked the numbers-based thing. There's also nothing wrong with numbers-based. I mean, whether we're talking about time, watts, all those different things, but we have to be mindful of the fact that that's not the only thing, hopefully, especially if you're dealing with a developmental athlete, that's hopefully not the only thing that you're facilitating their development of. And so if that's the only thing that you're talking about in driving, you're never bringing in any of these other elements. If you've never looked at an LTAD model to see what should be developed at this stage from those different areas, and then hopefully, as Sean mentioned, we're going to be developing one that's specific for American cycling, then you're not really facilitating all of their growth and development. It's like being just a one subject teacher. in their high school education. There's a lack of better analogies.
Yeah, I think even that brings up a point of when do you introduce some of those more quantitative number-based things, especially with youth and how fast that changes. Is the kid ready for that emotionally or cognitively to understand that and to accept that? And when you can go online and find out anybody's numbers, then there's that, oh, I don't stack up issue. And you as the coach have to then deal with that as, yeah, you're right. You're looking at that 28-year-old numbers, you're 15. A better thing might be to look at that number when that kid was 15, but even then I think that's fraught with danger.
Yeah, I'm always, and this I will differ with different people. I know I could get into probably arguments with people on this, but you asked me, so I'll answer. I'm not a big fan of tons of numbers for kids super early, because I think they tend to fixate on the numbers before they get some of the other developmental factors. It's like they get so wrapped up in the numbers and they think that, oops, sorry, that's an unwanted extra person in the picture. They get so caught up in the numbers, they don't realize that those other things are so important. And so I would really hesitate on bringing numbers in until you get a kid who has started to train on a regular basis and is really showing sort of that dedication to being able to do that, do training, get hours in, get some time on the bike, get feedback to you. And once they can do that, and it's also a big, expensive extra piece to add into anybody's training. I know it's cheaper than it used to be, but layering that in is something to grow to, that, hey, when you're ready for this, we'll add this next piece in. And then start bringing the numbers in, because now they know how to give you good feedback. They understand RPE. They understand what it feels like. They've had to develop that sense of self on the bike, as opposed to the numbers told me. And so I'm a big, big fan of that. This is where I get in trouble with my junior athletes. No music, no power. Even if they've got them, there's a time and period I don't want them using them, because they need to learn how to do that without the external stuff. They need to understand that, or they will hit a wall and struggle to continue to grow.
We're at the bottom of the hour, and I don't know what Kristen's schedule is like.
I'm not going anywhere if people want. This is my favorite topic, and it sure beats doing my annual report.
Spoken like a true academic instructor there. How about we go through a couple of more, but understanding that folks who need to duck off, feel free to. As Sean said earlier, this is going to be recorded, so it'll be available. Anything you missed, but we want to be cognizant of folks' time and appreciative of people who have joined us for this time as well. All right, how about we throw a few more at you here then as I scroll through. I'm trying to hold off on probably the controversial one there towards the end. And here's more of certainly a coaching question that goes outside of our ADM, but a little more on the how to coach stuff. How does a coach take a powerful, quote unquote, athlete and convince them that they lack the skills and knowledge to be world-class riders?
David, that's such a good question. You've got to build a lot of trust with an athlete first. Right? You can't just come out and say, yeah, glad you got the engine, but you don't have the body to do it, right? Or you're glad you got the engine, but you don't have all the bells and whistles it's going to take to race the car. Because that won't be heard well. You've got to start to build that relationship and then look for those opportunities to help the athlete realize it. What went on in that race? Well, I had the engine, okay, but it didn't come to the finish line. What happened? And really put them in that position where they have to start processing that in themselves. Because unless you're somebody that they look up to and they say to you, what did I do wrong? What's not happening? They're not looking for you to tell them that. They don't want to hear it. And it's not going to do anything from an ego, self-protection. Keeping in mind, and this is where some of this went earlier with juniors, all of us develop our identity around the things that we do and the things that we feel competent at. And this is why it's so important that competence is based on how we feel about our performance, not just what the extrinsic things are telling us. And so if you start to challenge an athlete's sense of identity and telling them that they can't do it, it will be a really hard pill to swallow and one that's hard to listen to. And so it's about building that trust and then looking for those opportunities to say, all right, we got the engine. I want you to try this in the race, and give them a chance to try something. And then come back and say, but I couldn't break away. Okay, so maybe you're not ready yet to do this, because being able to break away is a skill, not just about your engine, right? If you're the big fish in the little pond, you'll break away because you got the engine and nobody else does. Put you up a level, and all of a sudden you can't break away anymore, because those riders know what they're looking for. They watch you, they know what's going on. You don't know how to shake them. So let's develop those skills. And so you're going to have to find those baby steps or those opportunities to show them things. I remember a long time ago with Sam, as we were getting ready for the mountain bike national championships, and then down the road a little bit the Olympics, one of the things we had to do was we had to go out and start saying, okay, what is that course going to look like, and what don't you know how to do? And so it was go ride this and then come back and tell me what it was like. And so we had built up such a relationship of trust that he could come back to me and say, yeah, I didn't know how to do that, or that I couldn't. But I made it a safe place for him to tell me that, because now we could work on it. But if we'd started there when he was 17, he wouldn't have told me that, because he wouldn't have trusted me. He wouldn't have trusted to be able to admit that sort of weakness or that perceived weakness. So time, trust, and then looking as a coach for opportunities to set him up, not for failure, but for recognition of a growth opportunity. Just trying to differentiate. I don't want them to fail. I want them to see, I couldn't. And then how do we fix that? Keeping growth mindset in mind. If you haven't read Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck, that's another good book that can help with that conversation. And someone mentioned in one of the chats here I was looking at about books, that is a very, very readable book by an athlete. Very easy book to get them to read and then talk about. And I do often recommend all kinds of books, from a New York Times bestseller to textbooks, just depending on the athlete, how engaged they are. Here, read this, then let's talk about it. Here, watch this, then let's talk about it. I got to plug this. I was thrilled today. Darren Johnson, long time ago, camp athlete and stuff, and he has some podcast or some video blogs out, and I was really thrilled. One of my athletes sent me one today. I'm like, I know that kid, and he's now a coach himself and doing some nice work. And I'll go watch this, and then we'll talk about it. And I do that all the time with folks. So much so that my athletes now do it to me, which gives me more to read, but it's a good thing.
Kristen, this is a long one, so if you want to open up the Q&A from John down at the very bottom here. What resources can you recommend for the learn to train into the train to train transition, specifically looking for those youth athletes who are not on a competitive track but clearly want to perform better? And then where do you start with them on that? And I would place in here that you never know where someone's going to end up, that someone who's not on a competitive track now in 2 years may decide that that's their thing. And there's a great picture. If you pull up, I put the link in. If you look at the LTAD 3.0 model from Sport for Life, back somewhere deep in the document, there's this great graphic with all these arrows all over it that show the transitions at different, or the paths that different people took to get to high levels. And that it's not that linear growth path. But anyway, I want to toss it in there that you never know. They may end up also being your best athletes long-term, even though they may be a little behind. We see that in tons of other sports.
Well, I think that's a 101 of teaching, and Sam brings up, it's really important. If you're going to coach, if you're going to coach anybody who's not already at a national level, you're on the developmental pathway of coaching. And you need to go into coaching those athletes the same, regardless of where you think they're going to go, if you're really truly doing developmental pathway coaching. So if I'm coaching high school seniors, or I'm teaching high school seniors, right, and I've got a class of English, I'm going to treat them hopefully all the same and push and challenge them each individually within that class, but I'm not going to be going in and going, oh yeah, you're too dumb to go to college and you're going to go to college, right? Hopefully that's not my mindset as a teacher, because that makes me a really poor teacher. That puts me in a position where I have predetermined what someone's ability is, and I'm not going to offer them anything else, because we know from how we approach people that if we decide ahead of time what we think they're capable of, then we only give them a certain part of ourselves and a certain part of our teaching skills. So long-term development teaching really says you go in thinking, this is what kids at this level need. And so that sheer fact of, oops, it moved. Where did it go? The sheer fact, oh, I see what it did. The sheer fact of they are at learning how to train, regardless of whether they might be champions someday or not, learning how to train is a specific phase where kids are developmentally not ready yet to be high performance adult athletes. And so what is the appropriate way to introduce them to a little bit of structure and a little bit of fun? In cycling, there's not a lot of great resources yet. That's something that I think Sean and I and others hope to come out of this project, is to start to think that way and apply these ideas over into our field. If you get a chance, USA Hockey actually has done a really nice job. Now you got to translate some of their concepts from what they're doing in a rink setting with team sport to this, but it still is an interesting read if you go look. So if you look at a practice at a U8 level, there'll be a certain amount of gameplay, just fun, skate around. There'll be little drills that are game-based stations and ideas. The idea is to get the kids skating, moving, engaged. But then you look at a U12 practice and you'll see there's still a little bit of game, but there's a little more structure, a little bit more seriousness, a little bit more focus. You might do just a little bit of nutrition talk here at the younger level. And then as you get older, you do a little bit more. You challenge them a little bit more. You say, what'd you have for lunch today? Oh, 2 Swiss rolls and those little ho-ho things, or, this, what do we think might be a better choice for lunch tomorrow for practice, right? And you start to do a little bit more of that, but it's about thinking about what grade am I teaching, if that helps at all as you start thinking about where those stages are. But yeah, right now, they're not the greatest resources. And I really do hope out of this conversation, we start to build some resources and think about what are the guidelines, what are best practices for in the sport of cycling to do these things well, knowing that some kids might be ready at 14 and some not till 18. Cycling is a hard sport to train for. That's something we have to keep in mind, that, as adults, this is a hard sport and it chews people up. I mean, there's a reason why our junior ranks have such challenges with keeping numbers and the junior to senior transition. It's a hard sport, time consuming, life consuming, money consuming, mileage on the car consuming, whole 9 yards.
All right. As a wrap up here, so that we are conscious of Kristen time, I'm not going to read the whole question, but I'm going to try to summarize it in a really short one. Is where do you, and Sean might want to jump in on this as well, where do you see the USA Cycling Academy fitting into this long-term athlete development model?
Where's that one?
It's kind of at the very top question.
Goodness gracious.
I know, making you scroll. How dare
Whose?
I? Jim.
Very top?
Yeah.
Bernard's program over in the cycling house that was over in Belgium is sort of that model. And we've had a few others that was the one that a lot of people were sending kids to 10, 15 years ago. They're not bad models. They are very dedicated. They work. It's the same idea as the IMG Academy down in Florida across other sports. You want to be an elite gymnast. There are certain gyms you go to in the country. Granted, that's an early specialization sport. I don't have a problem with it per se, but as noted, it's not talent-based. It's going to be who can financially afford it based. And so from a perspective of growing our sport and really growing athletes in our sport, I don't think it's going to serve that purpose. It's going to take kids who have the money and the affluent, same thing, affluence, but also the privilege to be able to do those things. And it will give them the best opportunities to maximize their development. And so those kids will benefit from going through and getting that special attention. There is some limited data to suggest that, when kids get the attention because they are the biggest ones in their age or they're perceived to be this or that, go back to our Pygmalion theory or teacher expectations of students. There is research to suggest that when we expect it or when we give the resources, people can maximize their potential. It's basically the Harvard principle, right? You went to Harvard, there's a better chance that you'll have doors open than if you did other things. Because at the academy, it's going to be both about the experiences and the opportunities, but also who you meet and networking in the system. And we're a small sport. But I think if we're really trying to grow our sport, if we're really trying to get more people on bikes, more people to appreciate bike racing, more people to engage in it, whether it's competitive or recreational, then I think that it's not going to do what we need it to do, particularly when we start looking at diversity and inclusion. And, so I don't want to knock the program. It is what it is. It's an entrepreneurial model, and it will produce people who will do well. Will it find our champions? Our best champions, our best bets. We won't find any Taylor Finneys in a rough that way. Right? Taylor found his way here because Taylor had amazing parents, had an interest, and he's an amazing young man. Well, he's not a young man anymore. I guess he's now a man. But, that was there. But the kid who just turns to his mom and dad and says, oh, I'm interested in cycling, don't have parents involved and don't have tons of money, we don't have any avenues really to help find those kids. And I think about some of the women that we've found over the last 10, 15 years, whether it be taking some of our women who've been very good soccer players or other sports and aged out of their high school level, or maybe even their college, and they've gotten into it, or that have quit their high-powered jobs and high-pressure jobs and found cycling as, mid-career professionals and done amazingly well. We don't have a lot of pathways and support for that. And that's where I think when we start thinking about long-term athlete development, we have the potential to enhance a system that can do that. But that's me being kind of ideological and belief that sport can solve all.
Through the chat box, somebody brought up that there are scholarships that are going to be available for it too, and we intrinsically don't know what that looks like yet, right?
And the challenge there is going to be too that there are going to be scholarships, and that's awesome, and that will hopefully help. But if it's being done if we're not careful and we're not looking at making sure that there is a pipeline of talent development, not cherry picking. So what I mean by that is if you take a bunch of kids and you go, you throw them all out and you try something, you do something, and little Steven here has got parents who've cycled, has been riding since he was 5 years old, and so he knows what he's doing. He might shine really, really well, whereas another kid who just picked it up 2 years ago, training age is very young, but he hasn't had a chance to develop, or he's been thrown into a model where he has to race but never learned his skills. We might pick the wrong kid. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because we want to champion all kids and move all kids forward. But if we're trying to figure out what talent really looks like, we will identify it wrong because we're doing it too early and in a way that's not developmental based. Whereas if you have a program that is long-term athlete development based, when it comes time to make decisions about who are kids that are really starting to show aptitude. So if we think about go back to our classroom model, right? If we've got a classroom that's really well structured, we'll have progress markers along the way. We'll have watched this kid in multiple ways, and we'll have a way to start to tell, is it because they were that they came in so strong from another sport? Is it because mom and dad's given them a lot of time? Or have they been systematically and consistently developing? And are they ready for this? Because that's the other big piece here, is we throw a lot of kids into next level, higher level before they're ready and before they have the skills. And we don't last very long when we do that. Or they last, but they don't enjoy it. They get entrapped. They feel like they have to. And I've worked with a lot of kids in the last 10, 15 years that want to quit, and they don't know how to tell their coach, and they don't know how to tell their parents. And so
right.
Talking to me about it, and then I look like I'm the one who's pushing them out of sport. I was like, they're done. They just don't know how to tell anybody. They don't want to disappoint anybody. So much money, so much time. Mom and dad started a team. A lot of pressure on a kid before they're ready for what comes with the fun side of being the best on the team. They don't have the skills yet to handle the pressure of repeating that performance and all those types of things. So I think, this is where we come back to how do we develop a system in which we can truly pipeline and feed athletes up so that those scholarships can make a difference.
Right. Now, I think that'll take time. Right.
We're looking at, just to give you guys all an example. So USA Hockey's ADM is 10, 11 years old now. It took them a long time. There's still challenges with it, but they are just now seeing the effects of the pipeline in their junior elite 17, 18-year-olds with better skaters, better fitness on the ice, more kids in the talent pool. That's the big thing about this, as Sam was noting earlier. You do long-term athlete development right, there's a greater pool from which to draw those elite. And that shouldn't be our reason for doing this, but you want to increase your scholars, you got to have better program, and it's going to take the actual developmental cycle of the kids starting here and getting here.
Well, and Sean, from your perspective at the Cycling Association, hockey also has good data showing that the clubs that adopted these ADM models of small-sided games, cross-ice playing, which people will tell you that's not real hockey. And I mean, we have this conversation with Martell almost every week at hockey, and yet those clubs that adopted that retained more kids. That means they retained more money from those kids and the parents as well. So financially, those clubs were well off because they weren't just cherry picking the best kids and sending them off. They were really trying to grow and develop every kid for as long as that kid wanted to be developed and wanted to be in the sport. And that's something I want to swing around to. I'll be more idealistic here than Kristen, and this will, I'm glad she's sitting down, is really got to look at this about keeping people in the sport for as long as possible. They're not all, few are going to be top level bike racers, even if you're going to make the Olympic or World's team. But you know what, if they're racing at 40, that means they're supporting the sport for that next generation coming along. Maybe they become, coaches or race officials or people running the timing system or on the board of local clubs, or just they hit the jackpot and donate money to things. So it's all that stuff plays into it that, that kid that sort of gets run off at 16 could be a kid that at 35 is helping the sport out in some way and maybe does that in another sport. I work in a sport now that has no Olympics, has no professional rank to really even remotely speak of. And it's actually kind of refreshing in a way, because I think it very much looks at, hey, this is a fun lifetime activity. And there are world championships and world competitions, but it's not the pressure packed sort of thing that other sports I've worked with on. And it's actually kind of reinvigorated me in a way, because I'm not driven completely by that anymore. Like I said, it's very refreshing and re-energizing for me. But looking back at this, and if you look at the long-term athlete development model out of Canada, I'm a big fan of it. That last stage is active for life. And within that, it is, are you an official? Are you recreational? Are you still highly competitive? As we know, many 40-year-olds are out there to win every race. That's still in the active for life stage. They are still hyper competitive. They're just doing it at a different level than they would have been at, 23 or 25. And so really, really, really bring it into that. And yes, Chris Merriam, it's so fun to reconnect with you. Chris actually attended an ultimate coaching clinic in where he lives. And so maybe he has a little insight into that and how we do that. So it's kind of really a lot of fun with that. So,
let me back up a little bit, Sam, because I think there's something important that I don't want to get missed here. One of the things we need to acknowledge about those clubs that have been successful, and this is why I've been doing work with hockey for about 10 years, predating my coaching my son on the ice, is that I'm really intrigued by how they're shifting their system of development. And so again, they looked at Sweden, they looked at the Norway models, all this other stuff that's out there. They were looking at this 10, 12 years ago, Ken Martell and his team. And one of the things we have to recognize about those clubs that have adopted ADM is that they didn't just adopt ADM for something that the athletes were going to do. They also then backed up and made sure their staff was trained. And this is where they are currently recognizing that there are challenges. And this is where I'm running into stuff in my local rink, is when the people running it assume that the activities will present the opportunities. They forget the value and the importance of the live person in the equation. And this is where it becomes, as a coach, so important to understand right age, right stage. Again, if you're going to teach, you need to know the age you're teaching, what they need, and then what the curriculum is, so that then you can implement that. And while you can, as a teacher, deviate from that curriculum based on the child's needs or the athlete's needs, if you don't have that foundation to start from, you really aren't systematically developing someone into a system. And this is where, so it becomes really important. We're a loose organization. We don't have the infrastructure. If you have to go to the rink, so you have to get, or you go to the pool, like swimming, and have to get. And so this is that call that I think Sean is starting to make as, and I've heard it at a couple of the level ones that we've taught in the last 5 or 6 years, of coaches being interested in thinking about us as a profession and how do we come together to drive this better model of talent development in support of the sport so that our kids don't hit 18 and age up or hit one of the age group bump ups and they're not ready for it, or they category up and they're not ready for it and they explode out. And I think all of you also can probably know, if you've coached a junior, you've had a conversation at some point where I didn't get picked for the national team, so I must suck. No, there's politics involved, there's proximity, there's all kinds of other factors that come into play besides just your raw talent. And so we can't take the fact of whether or not you competed on a national team. I've worked with a couple of national champions in our sport who won national titles, who had serious concerns and issues because they never were on a national development team as a junior. And so they thought that was their self-worth and really struggled before we sort of took away the, hey, you didn't make a national team. That's not an indication. That's an indication that our pipeline isn't really a pipeline. And that's no indication or no knock on USA Cycling. This is a really hard thing to build. And it's why internationally, this movement towards long-term athlete development has been a global force in sport. It's not just the US doing this. This is globally. We're talking to folks in Italy about it right now. Sweden's been doing it for a while. Norway's got quite a model, although they've got a nice inclusive country with small sport focus and a ministry. It's why Canada has, Australia has. It's not perfect. Yeah, they got the money. It's not perfect, and it's not a USA Cycling issue. This is a really unique juggernaut of an American system concern. And how do we work on it? And how do we help make sure that it's about development until it's time for it to be about performance? And until you're making a paycheck, performance is always the icing on the cake. When it's in your contract and you need the wins to get your next paycheck, then we can shift the focus a little more. But until then, it's got to be the other way around, or it's not sustainable for talent. That doesn't mean it's not really important and you care about it, but emphasis from a coach's perspective. And just Sam, to put it on one more thing, just because I think this will hit Sean's question earlier, the note about how long this takes. Sorry, that's Scooter. He thinks that you guys were talking to him. And I did not let him in. My son let him in halfway through the webinar, so I was trying to keep him out. But this idea of lifetime development, if we look at, I'm really, if anybody's been following Selena Yeager, she's written a lot for bicycling and gravel biking and all that kind of stuff. She started a group and a podcast recently, Hit Play Not Pause, which is about women in endurance and ultra endurance sport who have hit menopausal age and older, which is probably making everybody go, oh, I didn't expect that today. We're going there. But the idea being that there is a larger group of women than ever before competing into that age group. And the reason being is, if we trace it back, 72 was when Title IX was passed. It really didn't gather teeth until about 82, 83 with all the lawsuits that went back and forth. And it's still struggling in places to gain the traction it really needs if we really know what Title IX is. But women didn't have the opportunity to participate. It has taken a very long period of time from the opportunities for women to participate to the Rio Games, where we first saw that balance of, at least from the American side, men to women participating at a high level of performance. And so this is a long-term, important over immediate project where many of us are coaching immediately right now. So we've got to figure out what can we do here and there. But what Sean's asking us to really take a look at from a thinking about LTAD and thinking about coaching is from an important standpoint. The bigger picture of the pathway, that the kids in it right now, we're going to try to do the best we can for them, but we're trying to build that pathway for the system for the kids that are up and coming for the next couple of generations, and knowing that we really won't see how well this does, not from a big system perspective, for at least 7, 10, 15 years. But we do know from other models that we've seen play this out that it is working. And so do the best we can for the kids we have right now with the knowledge that we have and what we've got, and build the system to grow it, which is, I think, where the real excitement is.
Kristen, on that note, that was a great summary there. That's perfect. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, is trying to build for the future. We're not trying to take care of what's happening today, right? What's happening today is happening, and it's based on what we actually have available to us right now. And so the next discussion sessions that we'll be running will be starting to think about the future and start thinking about what what elements we already have in place that we can already draw on. I mean, we're a very fractured sport, across a wide range of different disciplines and different silos of different governing bodies and things like that, don't always talk to each other. And so we're going to be, trying to take a step back as coaches to actually saying, what can we bring to the table? Because a lot of us work within those different models already. And so we can bring all that together into a platform that we can now draw on as coaches to best help the athlete, right? Because we're mostly interested in the athletes, not in the governing bodies per se. All right. So I really want to help thank Sam too for his help in all this. And please take the survey on your way out, or it will be sent to you tomorrow. And then I'll get everything posted up so people can watch this after the fact too. All right. Thank you very much. And have a great afternoon. Thanks again, Kristen, for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. I look forward to seeing you all in future conversations as we figure out how to work this together.
Great. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.